September 8, 1642. Plymouth Colony, Massachusetts Bay. The pig squealed as the noose tightened around its neck. Thomas Granger, 17 years old, stood on the gallows beside it, watching the animal that would die because of him, because of what he had done with it. The magistrates had forced him to identify every animal. One by one, he pointed them out in the farmyard. A mare, 2 goats, 5 sheep, 2 calves, a turkey, and the pig. His accusers needed to be certain. Under God's law, every creature he had known carnally would be executed before his eyes. Only then would the rope claim him. Governor William Bradford himself recorded the proceedings, his hand steady as he wrote the words that would immortalize this moment. A very sad spectacle it was, for first the mare, and then the cow and the rest of the lesser cattle were killed before his face according to the law. Leviticus TX 15. The colonists believed they were building a city upon a hill, a pure Christian society free from the corruptions of England. They had crossed an ocean to create Eden in the wilderness. But the truth was far more terrifying than any serpent in their garden. Before we uncover the truth about the Plymouth Colony pig trial, when a teenager's unnatural acts led to the execution of 8 animals and exposed the darkest fears of America's earliest settlers, make sure to subscribe to Fierce Sermon and ring that notification bell. We're exploring the cases history tried to bury, and we need you with us on this journey. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers. Now, let's descend into one of colonial America's most disturbing legal cases. The year 1642 existed in a world we can barely comprehend. The Plymouth Colony had survived for 22 years on the edge of a continent that terrified and fascinated the English settlers in equal measure. These weren't adventurers or treasure seekers, these were separatists, religious, fundamentalists who believed the Church of England had become irredeemably corrupt. They called themselves saints. History would call them pilgrims. By 1642, the initial desperation had passed. The colony had weathered the starving times. They had negotiated peace with the Wampanoag. They had buried their dead and welcomed new arrivals. Plymouth wasn't prospering exactly, but it was surviving. About 300 souls lived scattered across 7 settlements, farming the rocky New England soil and fishing the cold Atlantic waters. But survival wasn't enough for these colonists. They had come to build something unprecedented, a society governed entirely by biblical law, where every statute in Leviticus held the same weight as any decree from King Charles. Their legal code didn't distinguish between civil and religious offenses. Blasphemy could be punished as harshly as murder. Working on the Sabbath carried the threat of whipping, and certain sexual sins, including sodomy, adultery, and bestiality, demanded death. Governor William Bradford understood the stakes. He had been governor for most of the colony's existence, a man of iron will who believed Plymouth's survival depended on absolute moral purity. He wrote extensively in his journal about his fears for the colony's future. The wilderness surrounding them wasn't just a physical threat. It was a spiritual one. The devil prowled at the edges of civilization, seeking any weakness, any crack in their holy armor. Thomas Granger arrived in this world as a servant. Indentured servitude formed the backbone of colonial labor. Young men and women would sign contracts promising 7 years of work in exchange for passage to the New World. Thomas came from England as a child, perhaps 12 or 13, bound to a master whose name has been lost to history. He worked on a farm somewhere in the Plymouth jurisdiction, possibly in the newer settlement of Duxbury, possibly in Plymouth proper. No one recorded what Thomas looked like, whether he was strong or weak, bright or slow. Historical documents give us only the barest facts. He was 17 in September 1642. He was a servant, and he worked with livestock. In the Puritan worldview, servants occupied an ambiguous position. They were neither fully children nor fully adults, neither free nor enslaved. They existed in a liminal space, bound by law to their masters but also bound by God's law to righteousness. A servant's sins reflected on his master's household. A master bore responsibility for the moral condition of everyone under his roof. The farms of Plymouth Colony were isolated places. A servant boy might spend days seeing only animals in the distant tree line. The work was brutal, plowing, rocky fields, mending fences, mucking stables. The loneliness could be crushing, and in that loneliness, in that isolation, boundaries could blur. Something had been happening on the farms of Plymouth Colony, something the magistrates didn't want to acknowledge but could no longer ignore. The first warning signs appeared years before Thomas Granger's arrest. In 1636, John Alexander and Thomas Roberts faced charges of lewd behavior and unclean carriage one with another. The exact nature of their acts wasn't specified in the records. Puritan clerks often used euphemisms for sexual offenses, but the punishment was severe. Both men were publicly whipped and ordered to be separated permanently. The magistrates clearly suspected sodomy but couldn't prove penetration, which was required under the law for a capital conviction. Then in 1637 came a case that shook the colony's leadership to its core. A servant named John Humphrey was accused of masturbatic practices with a cow. Multiple witnesses testified to seeing him in the barn at odd hours. When confronted, Humphrey initially denied everything, then claimed he was merely helping the cow that was in distress. The magistrates didn't believe him, but without clear proof of penetration, without the legal standard of evidence required for bestiality, they couldn't execute him. Humphrey was whipped until his back ran with blood and banished from the colony. Governor Bradford couldn't understand it. In his private writings, he agonized over why Plymouth seemed to be suffering an epidemic of sexual deviance. Were they being punished by God? Had they failed to create the pure society they had promised? Or was something about the New World itself corrupting their people? Bradford wrote, "It may be in this case as it is with waters when they are close stopped up, they corrupt and putrefy, but when they have liberty to run forth, they remain clean and fresh. So it is with men. Their persons being restrained from liberty to satisfy their lusts, they thereby grow more rotten and abominable." He was trying to rationalize the irrational. The truth was simpler and darker. Isolated young men, often servants with no prospects of marriage, working alone with animals for months at a time, were committing acts the colony considered abominations worthy of death. The magistrates began watching more carefully. They instructed masters to supervise their servants more closely, especially around livestock. Rumors circulated. Neighbors began reporting suspicious behavior. A servant spending too long in the barn, unexplained noises from the animal pens at night. In 1640, Edward Michell and Edward Preston were found guilty of lewd and sodomitical practices. Both were married men, which made their acts even more incomprehensible to the Puritan mind. How could men with wives commit such perversions? The colony's leaders couldn't execute them. Again, the evidence wasn't sufficient for a capital conviction, but the punishments were brutal: public whipping, time in the stocks, and permanent branding. Edward Michell received a hot iron brand on his shoulder so everyone would forever know his sin. The pattern was undeniable. Plymouth Colony was experiencing what we would now call a moral panic. But, unlike later panics in Salem or elsewhere, this one was rooted in actual acts. Young men were in fact engaging in sexual contact with animals. The question wasn't whether it was happening. The question was what to do about it. The magistrates tightened their surveillance. Masters were ordered to account for their servants' whereabouts at all times. Special attention was paid to the stables and barns. The colony's leadership met in closed sessions to discuss whether their laws were strong enough, whether they were applying God's commandments with sufficient rigor. Then came the spring of 1642. A farmer in Duxbury noticed something strange about one of his sows. The animal had become skittish, difficult to handle. More disturbing, several piglets born that spring looked wrong, deformed. The farmer said nothing publicly, but he began watching his servant Thomas Granger more carefully. One evening in late summer, a neighbor claimed he saw movement in the barn after dark. Through a gap in the wooden slats, he witnessed what he described as unnatural congress between the servant and a mare. The neighbor didn't confront Thomas directly. Instead, he went to the magistrates. In Puritan society, bearing witness to sin was a community obligation. Remaining silent would make you complicit. The neighbor understood that his testimony could send a teenage boy to the gallows. But he also believed that God's law demanded action. The magistrates listened. They consulted their legal texts and their Bibles, and on a morning in early September 1642, they came for Thomas Granger. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. This is one of the most disturbing legal cases in colonial American history, and what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about our nation's founding. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries. Let's discover what happens next. The interrogation began on September 6, 1642. Thomas Granger stood before Governor Bradford and the colony's magistrates in Plymouth's meeting house. The room was small, cramped, lit by narrow windows that let in weak autumn light. This wasn't a courtroom in any modern sense. There was no separation between church and state, no presumption of innocence, no right to remain silent. Under Puritan law, a confession was the ultimate proof. And the magistrates had ways of obtaining confessions. They didn't torture Thomas, not physically. Plymouth Colony prided itself on being more merciful than the courts of England. But the psychological pressure was overwhelming. Thomas was 17, a servant with no family present, no one to speak for him. He faced men who held absolute power over his life and death. Men who believed they spoke with God's authority. Bradford began with direct questions. Had Thomas been in the barn after dark? Had he been alone with the animals? Had he touched them inappropriately? According to Bradford's own account, Thomas initially denied everything. But the magistrates pressed. They invoked Scripture. They reminded him that lying about such sins would damn his immortal soul for eternity. Physical death was nothing compared to hellfire. They told him a witness had seen him. Something broke in Thomas. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was shame. Maybe, after months or years of carrying this secret, there was even relief in finally telling someone. He confessed. But the confession wasn't enough. Under the law derived from Leviticus 2015, a bestiality conviction required the accused to identify the specific animals involved. The biblical text was explicit. If a man lie with a beast, he shall surely be put to death, and ye shall slay the beast. Both the person and the animal had to die. The animal wasn't being punished. Animals couldn't sin. But the creature had to be destroyed because it had been corrupted, made unclean. Its very existence was now an abomination that could contaminate the godly community. The magistrates took Thomas to the arms. Master by master, field by field. They made him point out every animal he had violated. Bradford recorded the moment with clinical precision. A mare, a cow, 2 goats, 5 sheep, 2 calves, and a turkey. 8 animals in total. Some belonged to his master, others belonged to neighbors. The turkey is particularly jarring to modern readers. It suggests the breadth and desperation of Thomas's acts. For each animal, Thomas had to explain when and how it had happened. The magistrates took careful notes. They needed the details for the trial record, for posterity, for their own understanding of how deep the corruption ran. The community gathered to witness the identifications. This was public business, a matter of communal purification. People who had known Thomas, who had worked alongside him, who had broken bread with him, now watched as he condemned himself and the animals. According to witnesses, Thomas showed little emotion during the identification process. Some interpreted this as evidence of his depravity, that he felt no remorse. Others saw a boy who had been broken, who had retreated somewhere inside himself where the horror couldn't reach. The trial itself was swift. Plymouth Colony's legal system didn't allow for prolonged proceedings. The evidence was clear, Thomas's confession and his identification of the animals. The law was clear. Leviticus 20:15 demanded death for both human and beast. The magistrates consulted with clergy from neighboring colonies. They wanted to ensure they were interpreting God's law correctly. A letter was sent to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, asking for advice. The response confirmed what Plymouth's leaders already believed. Execution was not only permitted, but required. On September 8, 1642, just 2 days after his initial interrogation, Thomas Granger was convicted of bestiality. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out immediately. But first, the animals had to die. The execution site was likely on Burial Hill, the elevated ground overlooking Plymouth where the colony's dead rested. The entire community was expected to attend. Public executions served multiple purposes in Puritan society. They demonstrated the consequences of sin, they satisfied communal justice, and they allowed the collective body to purge corruption from their midst. The animals were brought out first. Bradford's account emphasizes that they were killed before his face, in front of Thomas, who was forced to watch. The mare went first, then the cow. One by one, the animals that Thomas had named were slaughtered. The methods aren't specified in the records, but colonial practice typically involved throat cutting for large animals. The blood would have been considerable. The sounds would have been terrible. 5 sheep, 2 goats, 2 calves, a turkey. Imagine standing there, watching 8 creatures die because of what you had done with them. Imagine the community watching you watch them die, seeing your face, measuring your reaction, judging whether you showed sufficient remorse or damning indifference. Only after the last animal lay dead did the noose go around Thomas Granger's neck. The aftermath of Thomas Granger's execution sent shockwaves through Plymouth Colony and beyond. Governor Bradford dedicated several pages of his journal of Plymouth Plantation to the case. His writings reveal a man deeply troubled by what had happened, not because he questioned the justice of the execution, but because he couldn't understand why his colony seemed cursed with sexual deviance. Bradford compiled a list of sexual crimes prosecuted in Plymouth between 1642 and 1650, and the results horrified him. In addition to Thomas Granger's bestiality, there were multiple cases of sodomy, attempted sodomy, rape, adultery, and what the records call unclean practices. Bradford wrote, "It may be here demanded how it came to pass that so many wicked persons and profane people should so quickly come over into this land, and mix themselves amongst them." His answer was telling. He didn't believe Plymouth necessarily had more sin than other places. Rather, he believed Plymouth's commitment to prosecuting sin made these crimes more visible. In England or in other colonies with lax moral enforcement, such acts might go unpunished or unreported. But in Plymouth, where every member of the community was expected to watch for and report signs of moral corruption, nothing could remain hidden. This explanation satisfied Bradford, but raises darker questions. How many other young servants in other colonies were engaging in similar acts but never faced justice? How many masters knew and said nothing? How much suffering occurred in the shadows of less zealous communities? The legal precedent set by Thomas Granger's case reverberated throughout colonial New England. Other colonies examined their own laws regarding bestiality and sodomy. Some tightened their legal codes, making the definitions more explicit. Others established clearer evidentiary standards, requiring multiple witnesses or undeniable physical proof. Massachusetts Bay Colony, larger and more influential than Plymouth, executed several men for bestiality in the decades following Granger's death. In 1642, the same year as Granger, Massachusetts hanged a man named William Hackett for bestiality with a cow. In 1647, Thomas Sadler was executed for sexual acts with two mares. In 1662, a man named Potter was hanged after being caught with a sow. The pattern suggests these weren't isolated incidents. Colonial New England, with its isolated farms, its population of young male servants, and its rigid sexual mores, created conditions where bestiality occurred with disturbing frequency. But not all cases ended in execution. The evidentiary standards were high, and magistrates were reluctant to impose capital punishment without absolute certainty. Many accused men received whippings, brandings, or banishment instead. This created a two-tier system. Those with better social connections or those whose masters were willing to protect them might escape with their lives, while isolated servants like Thomas Granger faced the gallows. The animals, of course, had no such options. In every case where bestiality was proven, or even strongly suspected, the animals died. Colonial records from across New England document dozens of cattle, horses, sheep, and goats executed for having been corrupted by human contact. Modern readers struggle to understand this practice. Why kill innocent animals? The Puritan answer was theological. The animals had become unclean, polluted by contact with human sin. They couldn't be allowed to breed, lest they pass on some spiritual contamination. They couldn't be eaten, as their flesh was now tainted. They couldn't even be allowed to live, as their mere existence would be a constant reminder of the sin committed. In a community where everyone knew everyone, where resources were scarce and every cow or sheep represented significant wealth, these executions were economically devastating. A farmer who lost multiple animals to a bestiality case might face financial ruin. Yet the colonists accepted these losses as necessary for spiritual purity. Thomas Granger's master, whose name is conspicuously absent from all records, would have lost the mare, possibly the cow, and potentially the economic value of several years of Thomas's remaining servitude. If the master had failed in his duty to supervise his servant, he might have faced community censure or even legal penalties. The silence in the records suggests the master may have been someone influential enough to avoid scrutiny. The psychological impact on the community was profound. Parents became more controlling of their children. Masters watched servants with new suspicion. The simple act of a young man entering a barn alone became charged with sinister possibility. Plymouth Colony never recovered its early idealism. The realization that he could cross an ocean, establish new laws, and build a godly society, yet still face the same human corruptions as in England, shattered something fundamental in the Puritan psyche. If even here, in their city upon a hill, young men were copulating with animals, what hope was there for humanity? Bradford aged rapidly after 1642. His journal entries became darker, more pessimistic. He had arrived in Plymouth as a young idealist in 1620. By the 1650s, he was an old man grieving for a dream that had failed. The Thomas Granger case also contributed to a shift in colonial legal thinking. Over time, New England colonies began to distinguish more clearly between civil crimes, which could be punished by civil authorities, and sins, which were matters for church discipline. This wasn't secularization exactly, but a recognition that the biblical legal code couldn't address every situation they encountered in the New World. By 1700, prosecutions for bestiality had become rare in New England, not because the acts stopped occurring, but because communities developed unofficial ways of handling such cases: quiet dismissals, forced marriages, exile without trial. The formal executions of the 1640s gave way to pragmatic solutions that protected community reputation at the expense of public accountability. Thomas Granger himself left no voice behind. We don't know if he felt remorse or defiance, if he believed he deserved death or considered himself unjustly punished. We don't know if anyone visited him in his final hours, if clergy offered him comfort, if he prayed or wept or raged. History records his name, his age, his confession, and his death. The person behind those facts remains forever silent, reduced to a cautionary tale in Governor Bradford's journal. The Thomas Granger case reveals uncomfortable truths about early American society that complicate our national mythology. We're taught to see the Pilgrims as religious freedom seekers, brave founders of American democracy. The reality was far more complex and darker. These were fundamentalists, establishing a theocratic state where biblical law superseded all human rights, where community surveillance was constant, where deviation from rigid norms meant physical punishment or death. The bestiality prosecutions of colonial New England also illuminate the unspoken history of human sexuality. Throughout history, in agricultural societies where young people had limited opportunities for sexual expression, contact with animals occurred more frequently than modern people want to acknowledge. The silence around this history doesn't mean it didn't happen. It means we've chosen to forget. Ancient legal codes from multiple cultures include prohibitions on bestiality, suggesting it was common enough to require legislation. Roman law addressed it. Medieval European law addressed it. The fact that the Puritans brought these laws to America and then had to enforce them repeatedly tells us something significant about the conditions of early colonial life. Young male servants, often in their teens, worked in isolation with no prospect of marriage for years. Female contact was strictly controlled and often forbidden. The Puritan culture was deeply repressed sexually while simultaneously obsessed with sexual sin. Into this pressure cooker, add loneliness, adolescent hormones, and constant proximity to animals, and the result becomes, if not understandable, at least predictable. The case also reflects the Puritan obsession with pollution and purity. Every aspect of their society was organized around maintaining boundaries between the godly and the damned, between civilization and wilderness, between clean and unclean. Thomas Granger's acts represented a violation of the most fundamental boundary, that between human and animal. This obsession with pollution would manifest in other ways throughout colonial history. The Salem witch trials, 50 years after Granger's execution, reflected similar anxieties above. Corruption infiltrating the godly community, the harsh treatment of indigenous peoples, who were often characterized as barely human, reflected these same boundary concerns. Modern scholars have noted that bestiality prosecutions in colonial America were almost exclusively of poor men, servants, laborers, the economically powerless. Wealthier colonists accused of similar acts often escaped prosecution through social connections. This class-based enforcement pattern would become a persistent feature of American criminal justice. The case also raises questions about the reliability of confessions in colonial legal proceedings. Thomas Granger confessed under circumstances we would now recognize as coercive, intense psychological pressure, no legal representation, interrogation by authority figures who held his life in their hands. How many others confessed to acts they didn't commit, or exaggerated their actions under similar pressure? Some historians have speculated that Thomas might have been falsely accused, that a servant whose master wanted to dispose of him could be easily framed for such a crime. The evidence, a single witness claiming to see something through a barn wall at night, would be considered highly questionable in any modern court. But in 1642 Plymouth, a confession was all that mattered, and confessions could be extracted through means we would now consider psychological torture. The execution of animals alongside humans also reflects a worldview completely alien to modern sensibilities. We've largely abandoned the idea that animals can be moral agents, or that they can be corrupted by human contact. Yet for the Puritans, the animal executions weren't just about destroying evidence or preventing breeding. They were about spiritual purification, removing pollution from the community. This practice continued sporadically in America well into the 19th century. As late as 1850, there are documented cases of animals being killed after suspected sexual contact with humans. The practice only ended as America urbanized and secularized, as biblical law ceased to be the foundation of criminal justice. The Thomas Granger case ultimately represents the collision between human nature and religious idealism. The Puritans believed they could create a perfect society through strict adherence to God's law. They couldn't. The wilderness didn't corrupt them. They brought their corruptions with them across the Atlantic. No amount of surveillance, punishment, or execution could eliminate human weakness. Bradford's journal entries after 1642 show a man coming to terms with this reality. His earlier writings are full of confidence and divine purpose. His later writings are melancholic, acknowledging that the city upon a hill was built by fallible humans who would never achieve the perfection they sought. Yet the attempt to impose that perfection, the willingness to execute a teenage boy and 8 animals in pursuit of spiritual purity, left a legacy that echoes through American history. The impulse toward moral absolutism, the conviction that righteousness demands harsh punishment, the belief that social order requires constant vigilance against corruption. These Puritan values never disappeared. They transformed, evolved, and persist in various forms in American culture today. The execution of Thomas Granger and 8 animals in Plymouth Colony stands as one of the most disturbing legal proceedings in early American history. It reveals a society so committed to religious purity that it was willing to destroy life, human and animal, to maintain the illusion of godliness. What do you think drove Thomas Granger to such acts? Was it loneliness? Was it the repressive sexual culture of Puritan society? Or was he simply a disturbed young man who would have committed these acts in any time or place? Leave your theories in the comments. Our community always brings fascinating perspectives to these dark historical cases. If you found this story as healing as we did, subscribe to Fierce Sermon for more lost chapters of American history that textbooks won't tell you. We're uncovering the cases that reveal who we really were, and perhaps who we still are. Next time, we'll explore another buried chapter from early America, another story that challenges everything we thought we knew about our nation's founding. Until then, remember, history isn't just what happened, it's what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget. See you in the next video.